In the heart of the wild American West, betrayal meets redemption. A paralyzed Apache woman was left to die in the desert until a retired sheriff risked everything to save her. This is their story of courage and fate. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Where are you watching from? Let's get started! The desert stretched endlessly, an ocean of red dust and broken stone beneath a sun that showed no mercy. Heat shimmered over the horizon, bending the air like glass, and the wind carried with it the dry whisper of death. A line of wagon tracks cut across the land, marking the path of settlers who had passed that morning, people chasing hope, land, and survival in a country that offered little of either. They left behind more than dust. Behind them, at the foot of a weather-beaten mesa, lay a woman half buried in sand, her breath faint, her eyes half closed beneath the glare. Her name was Taza, daughter of a proud Apache warrior who had once ruled the desert valleys with dignity and fire. Now, she lay still, her legs motionless, her mind slipping between memory and fever. 2 nights before, her band had clashed with a group of armed settlers near the San Pedro River. Horses screamed, guns thundered, and when the chaos settled, Taza's mare had stumbled over the jagged stones, crushing her beneath its weight. She could not feel her legs after that moment. Her tribe, believing her dead, had retreated under moonlight, leaving her body behind. But she was not dead, not yet. When the settlers found her the next morning, she was barely conscious. They hesitated, staring down at her through a veil of suspicion. Her face was painted with the ochre of her people, her dark hair tangled with dust. They argued among themselves. Some wanted to help, others warned that touching her would bring vengeance from the Apache. In the end, fear won. They gave her half a canteen of water, a torn blanket, and left her with a whisper of apology as they rode north. The sound of their wheels faded, swallowed by the wind, and Taza remained, her body still, her spirit tethered to a life she could not escape. The first day passed in unbearable heat. The second brought only silence. Buzzards began to circle overhead, their shadows drifting across the sand. Taza could feel the life leaking out of her slowly. The sun punished her by day, the cold by night. She whispered prayers to the ancestors, her lips cracked, her tongue dry as stone. The desert around her seemed alive, breathing, watching. Each gust of wind carried the voices of her people, but they offered no comfort now. She thought of her father, of the songs he sang beside the fire, and wondered if his spirit could see her now, broken, alone, forgotten by both worlds. Far beyond the horizon, a lone rider moved steadily through the wasteland, his horse weary, his saddle worn by years of travel. His name was Elias Granger, once the sheriff of Cochise County, now a man with no badge and too many ghosts. He had seen too much blood spilled in the name of justice, too many graves dug for men who deserved better. When the new railroad came, he'd hung up his star and left his post, choosing silence over duty. He rode south now toward Tucson, hoping to find a small patch of peace in a world that no longer cared for men like him. Elias was not a man easily stirred by the world anymore. He rode with his head low, hat pulled down against the sun, his revolver rusting in its holster. The desert had taken much from him, friends, faith, and the woman he'd once loved. Yet somewhere deep inside, a flicker of decency remained, hidden like an ember buried in ash. It was that same ember that made him stop when he saw the buzzards. 3 of them circling lazily in the air, their wings cutting black arcs against the pale sky. He narrowed his eyes, the lawman's instinct still sharp beneath the years of dust and regret. He spurred his horse forward, careful, curious. As he drew nearer, the smell of death touched his nose, the sharp, dry scent of decay. He expected a carcass, maybe a dead horse or a lost settler, but what he found was worse. Beneath the shadow of the mesa, he saw her. A woman, barely breathing, her skin blistered by the sun, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her eyes fluttered open when his shadow fell across her face, and for a heartbeat they met. 2 strangers, one nearly dead, the other long tired of living. He knelt beside her, his heart tightening at the sight of her wounds. "Easy now," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she could understand. Her body trembled as he poured a trickle of water between her lips. She coughed weakly, the sound raw and small against the vast silence. Elias looked around, the wagon tracks, the discarded blanket, the half-empty canteen. He understood what had happened. He'd seen it before. The settlers had found her, feared her, and left her to die. The sight filled him with something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet, burning anger. Not the kind that blazed, but the kind that settled deep, heavy as iron in the chest. The sun was dipping now, painting the desert gold. Elias took off his coat and covered her, his hands shaking slightly as he did. "You're gonna be all right," he said softly, though he didn't believe it himself. He studied her face, strong even in suffering, eyes fierce beneath exhaustion. There was pride in her still, the pride of a people who refused to bow to the world. He recognized it. He'd once had the same look, back when the badge on his chest meant something, back when the world seemed black and white. But life had taught him the colors in between were what killed a man. He sat beside her until the stars came out. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carried on the night wind. Elias lit a small fire, enough to keep the cold at bay. The woman stirred once or twice, murmuring words in Apache he couldn't understand. He watched her carefully, wondering if saving her was kindness or folly. The border towns were full of men who'd shoot him dead for helping a native. The tribes would do worse if they found her in the hands of a white man. But leaving her, no, that wasn't an option. Not for a man like him, not yet. As the night deepened, Elias leaned back against a rock, eyes fixed on the flames. He thought of the time he'd carried his wounded deputy 30 miles through the desert after a gunfight near Tombstone, only to watch him die anyway. He thought of his wife, buried under the mesquite tree outside Bisbee, her grave marked only by a wooden cross. He thought of how many times he'd chosen to walk away from trouble, convincing himself that the world was too far gone to save. But as he listened to the faint, ragged breathing of the woman beside him, something inside him shifted, a whisper of the man he once was. When dawn broke, Elias rose and looked toward the east. The sky was pale pink, the kind of color that promised heat and hardship. He knew the mission hospital lay 2 days' ride away. He didn't know if she'd survive the journey. But he did know one thing: he couldn't ride past this. The desert had seen enough abandonment. He packed his gear, tied his coat around her for warmth, and began fashioning a stretcher from his saddle and a length of rope. As he worked, the first light of morning fell across her face, soft and golden, and for the first time in a long while, Elias Granger felt purpose stir in his soul. The morning wind came cold off the desert, biting through Elias Granger's coat as he tightened the last knot on the makeshift stretcher. His horse snorted softly, uneasy with the weight of what lay ahead. He slid his hands beneath Taza's shoulders, careful as he could be, though she winced at the slightest touch. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice roughened by dust and years of solitude. Her breath shuddered, a sound between pain and surrender, but her eyes met his with something like trust, thin, fragile, but real. Elias lifted her gently, settling her onto the stretcher, and tied the rope secure. The trail to the mission was a cruel one, winding through jagged canyons and salt flats that shimmered like mirrors under the sun. Elias rode slowly, letting the horse find its rhythm, the stretcher dragging behind with soft, rhythmic creaks. Each hour felt longer than the last. The sun climbed higher, turning the sky white. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes. He gave her water when he could, drops at a time, careful not to waste any. She barely spoke, whispering in her language, sometimes calling to spirits he could not name. He only listened, silently, pushing forward. By midday, the desert was alive with sound, buzzing flies, the hiss of wind, the distant cry of hawks. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for the faint line of cottonwoods that marked the riverbed ahead. He thought of the men who had left her here. Good men by their own account, God-fearing settlers chasing a new life. He wondered if they slept well that night. He doubted it. The thought angered him, but more than that, it saddened him. The West had turned hard. Men carried fear like others carried faith, and in fear, they'd forgotten what it meant to be human. When the sun began to dip, the shadows grew long across the sand. Elias found a patch of mesquite and stopped to rest. He untied the stretcher and poured a little water into Taza's mouth. Her eyes fluttered open, fever bright. "Why you help?" she asked in broken English, her voice barely a whisper. The question struck him harder than he expected. He stared at the horizon for a long time before answering. "Guess I've spent too many years watching people die when I could have done something about it," he said finally. She studied him with quiet intensity, then closed her eyes again. That was answer enough. Night fell cold and silent. Elias built a small fire and wrapped her in his coat. He chewed on a strip of jerky, his mind restless. The stars stretched wide above them. The same stars he'd once used to track outlaws and lead posses through endless plains. He'd always believed the desert could wash a man clean if he stayed long enough, but now he saw the truth. It didn't wash anything away. It simply stripped you bare until all that was left was who you really were. He looked at her, this broken woman who refused to die, and wondered what the desert would make of them both. At dawn, he woke to the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. He froze, hand instinctively on his revolver. 3 riders emerged from the ridge, a group of Apache scouts, their faces painted, rifles slung low. Elias felt his stomach tighten. They reined in their horses at a distance, eyes sharp with suspicion. He raised a hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. One of the men barked something in Apache. Taza stirred weakly, lifting her hand in recognition. Words passed between them, rapid and low. The men dismounted, their expressions shifting from hostility to shock as they saw her condition. They spoke again, glancing at Elias with wary respect. After a tense silence, one of the scouts stepped forward and handed Elias a small pouch of water. He nodded his thanks, though he understood little of what was said. The tallest of them pointed toward the southeast, tracing a line in the dust, the direction of the mission. 2 days, the man said in halting English. Ride fast. Then they were gone, vanishing into the desert as silently as they'd appeared. Elias exhaled slowly. He'd been spared that day not by his gun, but by mercy, a rare thing in these lands. He turned his horse toward the rising sun and rode harder than before. The second day tested every inch of his endurance. His throat burned, his legs ached, and the horse stumbled more than once. Taza's condition worsened. Her breathing grew shallow, her skin pale as moonlight. Elias spoke to her often, not knowing if she heard. He told her stories of the towns he'd seen, of saloons where piano music mixed with laughter, of canyons so red they seemed to bleed at sunset. He spoke of his wife, of the badge he once wore, of the mistakes that had followed him like shadows. Talking kept him steady. Silence might have broken him. The desert had a way of doing that. By late afternoon, the sky darkened with storm clouds. Lightning forked across the horizon, thunder rolling like cannon fire. Rain came hard and sudden, turning the trail to mud. Elias covered Taza with his hat and jacket, shouting against the wind. The horse struggled, slipping on wet stone, but he urged it on. "Hold on, damn it!" he yelled, though she was too weak to respond. Every mile felt endless. His muscles screamed, his hands blistered on the reins. Yet he pressed forward, through wind and water and fear, until the shape of a mission bell tower appeared faintly through the curtain of rain. The sight broke him. He laughed, half sob, half prayer, as he rode the final stretch. When he reached the gates, the mission sisters came running, their white habits glowing in the stormlight. Elias slid from his saddle, lifting Taza as gently as he could. "She's hurt bad," he rasped. "Been out there for days." The nuns took her inside, their voices urgent, their hands sure. Elias stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, watching until the doors closed. Then his legs gave out, and he sank to his knees in the mud, the storm washing over him like penance long overdue. Days passed in silence. Elias stayed near the mission, sleeping under the porch, mending his gear, feeding the horse. The sisters told him little, but he didn't ask. He prayed, something he hadn't done in years. When at last they let him in, he found her sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes met his, clear now, calm. "You come back?" she said softly. He nodded, removing his hat. "Didn't reckon I'd ride all that way to quit now." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried gratitude deeper than words. He knew she'd never walk again, but she was alive, and that was enough. Elias left the next morning before sunrise. He didn't wait for thanks or blessing. The desert was quiet, washed clean by rain. As he rode away, he glanced once over his shoulder. The mission bells were ringing, soft and slow, carried by the wind across the plains. Somewhere deep inside, he felt something shift, a burden lifted, a ghost laid to rest. For the first time in many years, Elias Granger smiled beneath the brim of his hat. The West was still cruel, still unforgiving, but for one brief moment it had given him back his soul.